and realizing we have people in Afghanistan and Lithuania, people in Chile and Brazil and all over the place, Romania, Australia. So thank you all very, very much. Even a couple of people in London. Hello, London people. Cold, isn't it? Even a couple of people from just up the road from me. So thank you all very much for giving up your time. So what we're going to be talking about today really is this idea of emerging into English, this idea of where we start from when we begin learning English and how we get to where we want to get. And I'm going to begin just with a few little questions, okay? So imagine that you've got a beginner book, an absolute kind of starter level book. Have a quick think about the word went. What page do you think the word went might appear on in your average beginner book? Okay, give you 30 seconds just to type quickly. 35, 85. Can see we're not going to agree here. 56, 60, pages 1 to 2. Oh, I admire your optimism. Okay, and which page do you think the word been appears on in a beginner book? Okay, been. 120, 10, it doesn't appear. Okay, at the end, 35, page 7. Oh, not in a beginner book, no clue. I admire your optimism. Okay, your honesty. No page, next year. Okay, so another quick question. Imagine you've moved up a level, you've managed to scrape through beginner level and you're in elementary. Which page do you think the word went appears on in an elementary book? Maybe right from the beginning. Well, that is a logical kind of idea. Page 5, page 10, unit 5, page 30, page 15. Interesting, you're all going for lower numbers here. And what about the word been in an elementary book? Page 50, page 30, page 100, page 1, page 15. Okay, again, much lower numbers here. Yeah, end of the book. Okay, so stop typing there. I'll reveal the basic answer. Andrew and myself are sort of coursebook nerds, and we spend a lot of time going through books, checking statistics, finding out how frequent things are, finding out where things appear. And you may be surprised to know that in a beginner level book, the word went, on average, in most books, appears on page 72. Okay, given that most beginner books are quite short, that's basically right near the end of the book. And as some of you guessed, the word been doesn't appear at all in a beginner book. If you then move up to elementary, on average, the word went, some of you are logically thinking it might appear from the very beginning, given that it's already appeared in the starter level, but no, it appears on average on page 54. Okay, so you have to go through the first sort of 53 pages before you get to see went again. And been appears right near the end of elementary, usually. It's on page 96 on average in most mainstream course books. Okay, so a couple more quick questions. Imagine most global series of course books. When do you think the verb phrase have to is first taught? What level? Have to. A2, elementary, beginner, elementary. Logical guesses, elementary, A1, A2. Okay, B1. Oh, you're harsh. Okay, and the word if. A1, elementary, elementary. All of them beginner, elementary. Very logical. You're going to be surprised. Okay, so both have to and if don't appear as things that are explicitly taught in most global English series until pre-intermediate level. Okay, so students go all the way through beginner level, they go all the way through elementary level, they get to pre-intermediate level, and then finally they're allowed to see and learn and practice using have to and if. I don't know about you, but most foreign languages I've ever learned, if is one of the first sort of 10 or 15 words I ever need to use because it's so useful to express so many ideas. But no, pre-intermediate. So I think one of the problems that we often have with many global English series is we have this very restricted grammar syllabus, okay? We don't allow students to see things like went until right near the end of beginner level. They don't see been until right near the end of elementary level. They don't see have to and if until pre-intermediate level. And obviously on one level, this restricts the kinds of conversations you can have. It's difficult to talk about things if you don't have these basic building blocks. You might think they appear implicitly in listening or reading, but actually very, very rarely, because generally the idea is if they appear, they have to be taught. On top of this, I think they restrict the vocabulary that you can teach, because a lot of words basically don't appear in the present tense. You know, you take one of the most common verbs in the language, die. Generally, it's used in the past tense, okay, for obvious reasons. But because we're not showing students the past tense, we don't teach that kind of vocabulary. We end up teaching vocabulary that we present in the present simple. And a lot of words, it's not natural to use them in the present simple. They're more commonly used in the past simple or in the present perfect simple. On top of this, I think what happens is we have this kind of massed practice of particular bits of grammar. We have this idea that we have to do, 60 hours on the present simple before students are allowed to see regular past simples. And then we have to do all of the regular past simples before students can see went, which is actually the most common past simple word that there is. And I think particularly in this day and age, this kind of restriction clashes with the reality of language outside the class. In the old days, before the internet, if you were studying English, maybe in, a small town in Siberia, let's say, okay? Could be any other country or any other area as well. The English that you learned was basically the English that you met in the classroom. That was your little world of English. And maybe in that context, it makes sense to, keep the kind of language restricted. Nowadays, students have access to English from all over the world in all kinds of different formats. And outside of the classroom, the use of things like went and been and have to and if is obviously really, really, really not restricted in this kind of way. So by continuing with a very restricted grammar syllabus, we're clashing with the reality of language outside the classroom. So a quick quote to put all of this in context, okay? Present perfect more often than past simple. Yeah, I'll come to some of the questions later, okay? There's so many comments going on, I can't follow them all. Here's a quick quote. Any ideas who said this? It seems obvious that at least after elementary level, the largest part of a language learner's task is to build up an adequate stock of high priority words and lexicalized phrases, including both knowledge of their forms and an awareness of their more important meanings. Any idea who said this? Someone very famous within English language teaching. Michael Lewis, good guess, but no. Paul Nation, good guess, but no. Michael Swan is the correct answer. It's funny because people often think of Michael Swan as a famous grammarian, okay? But this was Michael Swan's quote from one of his more recent books, a kind of collection of his earlier work. And I think what's interesting for me about this is that really what Swan is actually saying is that at elementary level and at starter level, this should really be where students get the bulk of their grammar, okay? This should be where we're exposing them to as much grammar as we can manage. And when you look at a lot of useful grammatical words like might or must or should, I mean, these words are very, very high frequency words, okay? They're in the top sort of 100, 200 most frequent words of the language. And yet we restrict students' exposure to these words often until pre-intermediate. So I think what Swan's suggesting is that starter level, beginner level and elementary level is really where students need exposure quite early on. Obviously, they won't gain full mastery. They won't be able to do a huge amount with the grammar that they meet yet at this level. But they need to be exposed to it and they need to be experiencing it repeatedly over time at these earlier levels. Then, by the time they get to B2, C1, there's basically no more grammar for them to learn. They're just kind of learning to correct themselves better. One more quick question for you. What level from the CEFR do you think this is describing? Students can show a relatively high degree of grammatical control, don't make errors which cause misunderstanding, and can correct most of their mistakes. What level do you think that is? Yeah, B2 is the correct answer. Okay, so basically by the time you get to B2, so let's say sort of upper intermediate advanced, you can show high degree of grammatical control, you don't make errors, you can correct most of your mistakes. In order to do that, you must have had a lot of experience in meeting and using this grammar before you get to that level. Okay, and as Michael Swan said, once you get to this level, what's the issue for you is not grammar. Okay, maybe you need to be corrected, but the real issue is building up that stock of vocabulary. So I think what these quotes suggest for me is that we need to be encouraging in students a greater awareness of how grammar works at lower levels, up to sort of A2, B1. We need to have this development and increased understanding at B1 and B2, maybe a little bit more study, a little bit more correction, and then really by the time we get to advanced and proficiency level, there is almost no more grammar to look at. Certainly beyond the B2 level, when we get into the sort of advanced proficiency levels, the focus needs to be almost entirely on vocabulary and how the vocabulary is used. So, how many words do you think you need to know in a text in order to accurately guess the meaning of words you don't know? We often talk about guessing words we don't know. How many words? 100%, 40%. Whoa. Yeah, basically, in order to guess the meaning of words you don't know in a text, you need to know 97% of the entire surrounding text. So 10 unknown words on a page, not a chance. You need to be understanding 97% of all of the words around you. Okay? Now think of this. How many words, what number of words do you think you need to know to understand 97% of most academic texts? 4,000, 500, 3,000, 10,000. Yeah, you're all underestimating. So to understand 97% of most academic texts, which is the amount that you need in order to be able to guess, you need somewhere around 13,000 words. Okay, so when we tell students guess the meaning from context, that works assuming that they already have about 13,000 words, which of course most of our students don't. How many encounters with a word do you think you need before it becomes part of your productive vocabulary? You might be aware of this from your own experience. Yeah, 7 to 10, 30, I know the feeling. Yeah, I mean, most of you are going for the sort of 7 to 10. I mean, obviously it does depend, but I would say a minimum of 7. And, you know, for many of us, we've all had that experience of things we've encountered 10, 15, 20, 30 times that still don't yet become productive for us. But the basic answer is a lot. Okay? So I think we then have this problem of vocabulary control and syllabi or syllabuses that are driven by lexical sets. Where you have grammar-driven syllabuses, as in the majority of mainstream English language course books, I think they underestimate how much vocabulary we really need, as we saw with this question about what percent, how many words do you need to understand 97% of texts. Vocabulary knowledge and recognition of vocabulary, it's the main marker of reading ability and listening ability. The more vocabulary you know and can recognize, the easier listening and reading becomes for you. And I think the problem with a lot of traditional lexical sets is they tend towards teaching infrequent words, or at the very least, they miss very frequent words. So if you look here at this little list of words, medieval, bacteria, controversy, remark, moral, revenue, empire, underlying, conceal, allegation, these are all 2-star words in the dictionary. So these are between 2,500 and 5,000 most common words in the language. But we don't generally teach them because they don't fit into obvious lexical sets. The next list, minor, arise, somewhat, relatively, establishment, initiative, faith, restore. These are among the 2,000 most frequent words, in the language. But again, because they don't fit into any kind of lexical set, we underteach the most frequent language, which is the language that students are going to meet. And instead, we teach blonde, curly, wavy, dyed, because these fit into nice, tidy little lexical sets, despite the fact they're going to be far less frequently needed by students. So, another quick question. Imagine you're teaching an elementary class, or you are an elementary language learner. Which of these topics do you think you might be interested in talking about and learning about? Yeah, all of them, Inna. I know. I think basically when I'm learning a foreign language at an elementary level, I want to be able to do all of these things. Obviously, I won't be able to do all of them brilliantly at elementary, but I'd like to be able to at least have basic conversations about all of these things. In the same way, when you think about being an advanced student, okay, which of these topics might you be interested in? Well, all of them, presumably, because just because your language has changed, the things you want to talk about as a person remain fairly similar. So I think, again, another way of thinking about what happens as language learners is we don't necessarily move from wanting idiot conversations to wanting super sophisticated conversations. We often want to be able to talk about similar kinds of things. We just get better at talking about them as we go up the levels. And I think there's a real problem of treating students at different levels as different kinds of people, or as possessing different kinds of intelligences. Because I think what often happens in course books is at lower levels, and even to some extent at kind of intermediate level, we sort of avoid trying to let students express opinions, or avoid having them have any discussions about topics that we think may involve them saying things beyond what they know. They may try to use language that they can't use yet when they're trying to express themselves. And for me, this is problematic, I think, because I believe certain general principles about teaching all levels as a teacher and as a writer. And one general theme at all levels is there's a lot of language to learn, okay? Especially vocabulary, but not only. Another general principle is that the course book is only one route. No course book can cover all of one level, though I think some course books do cover more than other course books do. I think learning comes from repetition over time. I think students are people with a whole range of different interests, and generally, not always, as I'm sure you all know, but generally a desire to communicate. And language can also come from the students beyond the material. When we hear students trying to express themselves, we can help them say what they're trying to say better and feed in some language to match those kinds of meanings that they're sort of trying to express. So this brings us, I think, to some specific issues that I'm going to go on to address. At beginner levels and elementary levels, how can we help students to express their needs and wants, but to do it with just enough English, with very limited language? How can we ensure repetition? And can we try to make sure that there's a greater coverage of grammar without causing confusion? Okay. When we get to intermediate levels, how can students develop grammatical accuracy while still developing the necessary amounts of vocabulary? And by the time we get to advanced levels, what's left for them to learn? How do we as teachers or as a writer make choices about that? And how do we measure students' progress? Well, I think with beginner levels, the way that we enable students to express their needs and wants with very limited language is we teach some examples of grammar, basically just as phrases. So you teach something like, have you been to? Okay, or have you ever been to? You teach that not as an example of grammar, but just as a phrase like, what's your name? Or where are you from? Initially, you teach them just as phrases. You help the students to build up dialogues. You let the context and the teaching of the conversation clarify the meaning. Maybe for many of you, you might sometimes also use a little bit of L1, yeah, translation. We basically teach students just enough language to enable conversations. We don't teach things we don't need the students to learn yet. We teach short questions. We create little bits of space for the students to emerge into. And we try to make sure through a regular focus on conversation that there's more repetition in class over time. So here are some examples. This is from the forthcoming Outcomes Starter level, Outcomes Beginner level. We use this section called Developing Conversations as a way of teaching things that you could think of as grammar, but we think of just as useful bits of language. So we have one on called, okay? Obviously, you could look at called and say, oh, it's a reduced adjectival clause. I just think it's called. And at this level, that's all they need to know. So we show some examples. Do you know a restaurant called Gamma? On Long Street, there's a bookshop called Bradley's. Yeah, the students have space for them to add their own ideas, complete the phrases with names and places you know. A restaurant called Shalale, a clothes shop called Pop Boutique, a bookshop called Foyles, a village called Rye. And then they have little conversations. Do you know a restaurant called Shalale? No. Where is it? It's on Green Lanes, where I live. Is it nice? Yes. Is it expensive? No. Okay, we teach best. We're not teaching it as a superlative yet. We're not doing anything else about superlatives yet. We're just teaching best. We often use best to talk about one thing that's very good. What's the best restaurant? What's the best place to go? It's best to take a bus. What's the best restaurant in your town or city? Best area, best market. We teach have you been, just as a fixed question. Have you been here before? Yes, 2 years ago. Have you been to Poland? No, never. Very simple. You just add countries and cities. Have you been to Brazil? Have you been to Romania? Have you been to Afghanistan? Yes, 2 years ago. No, never. That's it. So you're teaching these words in a very limited kind of context and not expecting much from your students yet. In the same way, you can teach a question like, where are you going? This was in a double page helping students get better at having conversations in stations. Where are you going? Lausanne, single or return. Is this the stop for the 98 bus? Yes. Where are you going? The museum. Very simple little practice. Where are you going? The City Museum. You need to take the 73 bus. You can walk there. And what you can then do is once you've introduced these, you can build on these and you can reuse them and recycle them more regularly in a way that I think mainstream courses traditionally haven't done. So here the students do a little listening. They hear people talking about their plans. They hear sentences like, I'm going home, I'm going to bed, I'm going to have a coffee. So there's a kind of receptive understanding. Yeah. We then have a little bit of grammar where I think maybe more traditional course books will think, oh my God, you can't teach something like going and going to at this level. We just think, well, we're not teaching everything about it. We're just teaching something very basic. And here, the meaning's basically the same. This is my plan. I'm going home. I'm going to the gym. I'm going to have a coffee. I'm going to play football. Now, this afternoon, tonight, tomorrow, on Saturday. All we ask the students to do here is just move these words around. I'm going to meet my brother tonight. We're going to the park this afternoon. It's a very simple, receptive kind of process that helps the students deal with the basic meaning and produce very simple kinds of examples. But then later, we leave spaces for the students to emerge into. Okay, so they write more plans. They use a dictionary if they need to. The weaker students will just copy. I'm going to meet a friend after the class. I'm going home tonight. I'm going to school tomorrow. The stronger students will try to use this and add their own spaces. These examples are all from Outcomes Starter Level, which is coming out next month, by the way, which Andrew and myself co-authored. Then later, you can build on this, okay? Once you've done where are you going, you can then explore other ways of using the present continuous for talking about the future in very basic kinds of ways. So here you have what time are you going, where are you going, what are you doing after class, what are you doing tonight. All the students need to do is just complete the basic conversations with the questions. So it's very simple, it's very receptive, and then it's encouraging them to reproduce them. They won't all learn to reproduce these correctly yet. They won't be able to use these necessarily in any other contexts apart from these. But these are very, very useful, very common kind of conversations to learn to be able to have. So when you start thinking about exposure and repetition and reusing language over time, what we did was we did a quick analysis, okay? We took the world's best-selling beginner level book, and we took our book, Outcomes Beginner, and we looked at all the examples of the present continuous. Okay, in the best-selling beginner book on the market, you have they with the present continuous 13 times. I think this is the most common one because it's describing pictures. It's things like they are eating, they are walking, they are running. We only have this 11 times. They have you are ing 5 times. We have it 38. They have I am ing 7 times. We have it 56. It with the present continuous 4 times against 31 times. She, he 4 times against 5. Noun with the present continuous, they've only got it once in the best-selling beginners level book. We've got it 26 times because we have things like the traffic is getting worse. Yeah, the climate is getting worse. Unemployment is getting worse. So we have those kinds of examples. So across the whole book, in the global best-selling beginner book, you see the present continuous 35 times. In our book, Outcomes Starter Level, we have it 191 times across many different levels. In the best-selling book, there are 10 lessons over 2 units out of 14. For us, we have the present continuous appearing in 21 lessons across 7 units. So it's more spaced out. There's more chance for students to re-encounter it and get to grips with things. By the time you then get to elementary level, okay, I think the first point is we shouldn't be starting as if they know no language. When I asked earlier what page went appears on in elementary books, and some of you said from the beginning, surely. Well, yeah, surely, because if they've seen it at starter level, then you can assume that they've already seen it. I think the way that we ensure greater coverage of grammar at elementary is we don't start as if they know no language. We don't wait another 50 pages until we introduce went. We keep this kind of dialogue-based approach and we build on this. We still need to have low expectations of how accurate students are going to be in their production. And I think we need to have frequent words for discussion, not just for naming things. So not just for walking around and saying hat, coat, jacket, rain, fridge, but for talking about the kinds of things that we suggested earlier elementary students might want to talk about. So this is what we've done with Outcomes Elementary. The present tense is first presented on page 10. There is, there are is on page 13. Past simple, including went, because we assume that students have already seen it, comes in much earlier on page 32. Have to comes in early on page 60. We're not waiting until pre-intermediate because it's a kind of madness. So we're covering all of these extra little bits of grammar, including things like how long have you, not everything about the present perfect yet, just how long have you on page 121. So we're trying to make sure that there's encounters with more grammatical structures, but that we ask students to do less with them. Okay. Normally past simple comes after, past continuous comes after past simple. Yes, it does. It does normally. Yeah. And again, past continuous comes later because we're assuming they haven't met it at the lower levels. Yeah, you can argue with the layout yourself as you want, but you know, this is the way we've decided to do it, and this is how we think it works best in terms of focusing on conversations. Here's an example of what we tried to do at the elementary level, and you probably won't be able to see it particularly clearly, but it's just basically looking at one little conversation, which is, have you ever been there? There's a very basic dialogue. The students hear a little conversation, and they have things like, have you visited the Hagia Sophia? Have you tried Turkish food? Have you been to Istanbul? The students have very basic little conversations, and then they build on those. And all we're really trying to do here is just to help students have a very basic conversation about holidays. You know, you're on holiday, you're in London. Have you been to Big Ben yet? Have you tried fish and chips? Have you been to any clubs yet? You know, have you met many English people? Having these kind of conversations like this, where we're not asking them to do that much with the present perfect, we're keeping it narrow, we're keeping our expectations limited, and then in the recommending section, we're just teaching, oh, you should, okay, it's great, that's it. So then the students walk around and have little kind of conversations like this. Also at elementary level, it's this idea of teaching vocabulary not just for naming things, but for giving opinions. So there's some speaking. How important are these changes for your town or city? Better water, a bigger library, improved roads, a new stadium, a new shopping mall. So in a way, it's a kind of lexical set of places. In the vocabulary for and against, even though it's a vocabulary exercise, we're recycling going to. Okay, so these are comments about plans. Do the speakers support the plans or not? Are they for or against? It's going to save time, they're for. It's going to provide a useful service, for. It's going to cause a lot of pollution, against. So here they're seeing the grammar in action again. They're getting this kind of repeated exposure to the grammar, but we're also focusing on vocabulary that doesn't usually get taught in traditional lexical sets. So things like help businesses, create jobs, cut the number of cars. These are all really high frequency words that students are going to see time and time again. And again, it treats the students like adults. It helps them have basic conversations about serious kinds of issues. When students get to intermediate level, I think, we want them to develop their grammatical accuracy while still developing the necessary amount of vocabulary. I think one way we do this is when we're presenting vocabulary, the students need to see the vocabulary grammaticalized. They need to see it in use, not just matching vocabulary to meanings, not just words, but we need to be exploring how the words are actually used. The words that we focus on and the language that appears in the text needs to be high frequency, mid frequency vocabulary. We need repeated opportunities for students to do certain things. So lots of telling stories about different kinds of experiences, lots of problem solving, lots of dilemmas that encourages the students to recycle things like narrative tenses, conditionals. We need some extra space for students to kind of express their ideas and to be corrected. Students need to see grammar interacting with other grammar. Okay, they need to see, okay, yes, they still need to look at the present perfect, but they need to know how does it work in relation with other bits of grammar they may have studied. And maybe we need to get them thinking a bit more about the rules, maybe doing the grammar in a slightly more inductive kind of way. So in terms of grammaticalizing lexis, you might start looking at things like this. This is crime vocabulary. Rather than burglar, burglary, murder, murderer, those kind of exercises, it's basically thinking about describing crimes and talking about crimes you've read about or heard about. So it's things like, I got a phone call from the bank saying I'd gone $1,000 overdrawn. Someone must have got hold of my details somehow and used my card number. I was caught on camera, had to pay €100 fine. I was only doing about 65. So here, as a teacher, you can stop and you can say, yeah, what's the D here? That's right, I had gone. Why? Well, first I got the phone call. Before then, I had gone overdrawn. Someone must have got hold of my details somehow. I don't know how, but I'm sure they did it. So by thinking about how the vocabulary is used, it allows the students the chance to re-experience and re-encounter grammar that they've already met and had presented to them at lower levels. And it gives them a clearer idea of what to do with that vocabulary. I think also it's just thinking about things like this, you know, looking at exercises. Why else might you feel exhausted? How do you know if someone's pleased? How do you know if someone's furious? What kind of things might you feel guilty about or bad about? Why might you get upset? And thinking about the kinds of answers that come from the students and the way that that will involve mixing up the tenses. You know, why might you feel exhausted? Well, you've been working really long hours recently. How do you know if someone's furious? Well, they start screaming and shouting at you. Why might someone get upset? Because they've just had some very bad news. Okay? So again, it's letting the students have space, seeing if they can use the grammar to express ideas and helping them to grammar the language rather than just giving them, you know, another photocopied page of Murphy's Grammar in Use to do more controlled practice with. I think it's also thinking about, as I said, repeated opportunities for using grammar. So here, the ones in red are 3 exercises from the unit we actually have where they use narrative tenses. What's been your best moment using English? Have you ever helped anyone? Tell a partner about a time you forgot or lost something. But also in the intermediate and upper intermediate book, we provide all these other speaking opportunities, which also will encourage or necessitate the use of similar kind of grammar. So, you know, most surprising time you've bumped into someone, activities you've done recently, ever taken part in a competition, biggest change in your life so far. So all of these kinds of questions encourage students to practice using, and as teachers give you the chance to help students use grammar that they've already studied with vocabulary that they've already studied. It gives them that space. Also, making extra space for students and correction, you can do things like using these images. On the opening double page of each unit of outcomes, we have sort of striking looking pictures. So we have this picture here in Unit 2 of Intermediate on feelings. And we ask the students things like, how do you think these people feel? What do you think has been going on? What do you think they've been talking about? And as a teacher, what you can then do is to take those ideas and help them say them better. So you might get things like, he looks a bit fed up. They might have had an argument. The boy looks like he's been a bit naughty. Maybe the argument was over how to bring up the kids. Maybe she's too soft on the kids. You need to set clear boundaries for kids. You can't give in to them all the time. So again, when you're working from the students' ideas and you're helping them say things better, you're saying, yeah, I know what you mean. By working like this, it's very similar to the way we work as writers, where we're thinking about the kinds of things students might want to say and how we can show them the grammar and the vocabulary to have these conversations better. In terms of grammar interacting more with grammar, here's an exercise from intermediate outcomes where they're looking again at have you ever been to, but what they're doing here is they're seeing how this question, have you ever been to, interacts with other grammatical structures in terms of the way we use it. So at lower levels, you just learn, have you ever been to? Yes, no, okay. What you get here is things like, no, never, what's it like? No, never, but it's supposed to be amazing. No, never, but I might actually go at the weekend. No, never, I'd love to though. No, never, I've never really fancied it. Yes, I have. I spent a week there last year. No, never. I'm going this summer. No, never. Have you? I've heard it's quite nice. So here we're kind of layering or adding to the students' understanding of how the grammar works by showing them how this particular piece of grammar interacts with other pieces of grammar that they've already studied. Again, I think the other thing that you can think about is encouraging reflection and encouraging self-correction. So again, this is from intermediate levels, and it's taking some grammar from context, from listenings that they've heard. It's getting the students to think a bit more about which one's about situations that have happened before and may happen again, what sentences show possible future situations, what's the difference between will and might, which clauses give advice about future situations, and getting the students just to do a bit more active processing themselves of the grammar. So, advanced levels, what's left to learn? Well, some very minor aspects of grammar used in very limited contexts, maybe written English or maybe specific kinds of speech. More about the subtleties, which I've spelt wrong, of how words are used, quite difficult to teach. In terms of how you choose, well, it's quite random. Basically, you choose the language as it's needed. To be honest, by the time you get to advanced, you could almost have 10 different books at the same level, where you just focus on a whole range of different kinds of topics. But what we did do as writers ourselves was look through mid-frequency words and their collocates, and also look at a bit more idiomatic language, less frequent language. Students obviously need to read a lot, and they need to record more new words. In terms of measuring progress, it can be difficult, obviously. We probably at advanced levels need to place an extra focus on our own efforts to recycle and to set targets and to test and assess, because the infrequency of the language we end up teaching at advanced level means that just encouraging students to read or listen won't be enough to guarantee repeated exposure in the way that it will with lower level words like way or cut or best that are inevitably going to be encountered time and time again. So I'm going to stop there. I've rushed through that. I'll just very briefly mention the Teaching Lexically book that Andrew and myself wrote, and Lexical Lab, the website that Andrew and I run. We also run a summer school in London where we offer teacher development and language development courses. If you're interested, it's www.lexicallab.com. You can also email us for extra information if you want to know about the courses that we offer. It's info@lexicallab.com. I'll just type it up there. And obviously I should finish by saying that all of the examples you saw today came from the Outcomes series. We have the starter level, the beginner level, due out imminently. I wanted to leave some time for questions because I can see it's been very busy in the chat boxes there. So let's see what questions come up from you all. Thank you for the thank yous, but no need. I'm glad to hear that, Maria. Any questions anyone's got? How can you assess grammar lessons? Well, I think the way that you assess grammar is to think about it in very narrow kinds of contexts. So at low levels, like at beginner levels, I wouldn't expect any more than the student to be able to manage where are you going? Who are you going with? At a higher level, I might expect them to be able to produce things like, what are you doing tonight? I'm meeting some friends. So I think we just have to have an expectation of students being able to use the grammar in narrow kinds of ranges and then slowly broadening out. And we test them on the grammar in the context in which we've presented it in. Yes, it will be available as a presentation. Glad you enjoyed it. And yes, we do have all levels within the series. We start at the starter level, we go right up to the advanced level. And Andrew and myself wrote all of the levels myself. And yeah, I think, Delithia, this idea of practicing grammar and speaking in different kinds of ways with a lot of recycling and a lot of opportunity to re-encounter. So a few other things. What level of outcomes is it presented? The crimes vocabulary. That was actually from the upper intermediate level. Whoever asked that question. Elena. From Abdul Karim. What should be the focus at advanced level? Well, I think the main focus should be really boosting the amount of vocabulary students know and giving the students a lot of opportunity to read about, listen to a broad range of different texts, social, academic, professional, and giving them a lot of space to express their own ideas and share their own thoughts, feelings, and opinions. Another question from Irina. Do you arrange any special activities to help students see the difference between language registers? Yes, I mean, we do have some exercises at some points in some of the books where we're looking at more formal or informal kind of register, particularly in terms of things like writing emails, this kind of thing. We look at that. But I think the best way that you get students to recognize the difference between language registers is just to be clear when you're teaching. You know, this is common in everyday informal language. This is common in more formal written language. This is common in more formal spoken language. And just to be clear as we're going through with these kinds of things. So what else do we have here? What about homework? Yeah, I mean, for me, the first homework is go home and learn what we've done in class. Have a look at the vocabulary builder that's on the internet. Do the workbook, do the online workbook, which consolidates and extends what we've done in class. After that, fine, do what you want to do using English yourself. But I think the first homework has to always be go home, consolidate, and build on what we've done already in class. What else have we got? Sorry, I'm struggling to keep up here. Advanced learners feel they don't get much progress. Yeah, I think that's true because it's all item by item by item. And I think there what you have to do is to help students realize how many new items they've learned or what they can now do with the language that they couldn't do before. So I think it's a lot of low-level testing, Maria del Carmen. I think it's a lot of revision, a lot of recycling, a lot of helping them to make sure that, you know, that they're aware of the fact that they are adding to their stock of language. Should a teacher correct the students if they make mistakes? Sometimes in the spur of the moment, sometimes afterwards. I think the main thing to remember with correction is the correction won't lead the students to stop making that mistake. In the end, it's the exposure and the experience that stops students making mistakes. Mistakes with particularly grammar mistakes that happen because of first language interference. Correcting them has, you know, maybe a little bit of difference it makes, but it doesn't result in students stopping making those mistakes. Personally, these days, I tend to correct grammar a lot less than I used to. I mainly just sort of work on, yeah, I know what you mean blah, 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 blah. In the same way as when you're talking to kids. When kids say, we did go there yesterday, Daddy. I say, yeah, I know, we went there yesterday. I was with you, do you remember? And eventually over time, the students stop saying, I did go, and they start saying, I went. I think it's just being patient and not thinking that the correction will result in, you know, no more errors. Why do you think a lot of teachers will reconsider the traditional way of practicing recycling vocab in a productive way? No, I think recycling vocab in a productive way is a good thing, Zinaida. I just think we shouldn't expect everything to be productive immediately. A lot of the way I think we should think about things is language just going into a kind of a cement mixer or a churning kind of machine where it's swimming around in students' heads and we start to kind of get used to it a bit more. Where else are we? Thank you. You don't need to call me sir. Just Hugh is fine. How much time? Spacing out. I don't think we can think about it in terms of how much time, Luthia. I think it's just we need to make sure that the exposure to grammar is spaced out. The problem with a lot of traditional course books is that they do the present perfect in one unit and then you don't see it again in other units because the focus is on something else. For me, I think if we're focusing more on conversation and on actually using the language, there's going to be built-in recycling and spaced practice just inevitably, because conversation recycles, conversation encourages spacing out. So I don't think about it in terms of time. I just think make sure it happens. The advantages of teaching grammar inductively. I think there may be at slightly higher levels an advantage, Carmen, in that it helps students to clarify for themselves what they know already about the rules, and maybe the kind of formulating rules or generalizations themselves helps a little bit of that kind of knowledge to stick. Talked about the mistakes question already. What's a good way to revise grammar on advanced level? I mean, just through using the language. Correct them when they make mistakes, get them to do some exercises where they have to use grammar and vocabulary in consolidation with each other. I mean, at advanced level, grammar is not the problem, basically. They've studied all the grammar that there is to study apart from a few little bits and pieces. They just need practice in using it and practice in getting used to things. So I think it's a lot of, helping them to say things better. Aziz, feel free to contact me anytime you want. Any of you who have questions that I didn't answer, feel free. In Brazil, we're stuck to fixed syllabuses. Yeah, I mean, I would say that with outcomes, we do cover everything that you're expecting to cover for a fixed syllabus. And as you saw with things like the present continuous, we cover it more frequently and in more detail, more solidly over more time. So I think you can still be using outcomes and prepare students for exams. The students who do best in exams know more language and have encountered more language more thoroughly over time. So I don't think there's any conflict. Professional development opportunities. Yes, we do, Abdul Karim. We run teacher development courses in London. You can see examples. I don't know about the electronic format question, Michael. You'd have to ask Nat Geo. Don't they get overwhelmed? Only if you think, Pavel, that they're going to be able to do everything with it. I mean, when I was learning Indonesian, my main foreign language, I learned things like, how long have you been living here, as the third question, because that's what people asked me. It only becomes problematic if someone makes it difficult for you and says, oh, it's the present perfect continuous. Are you sure you're ready for it? All I learned was, how long have you been living here? And that wasn't overwhelming. That was useful. So I think it's thinking about what your expectations are. I would say actually what students really get overwhelmed with is the kinds of exercises they get in big selling elementary course books, which make them do, we are not Brazilian, we are Polish, are they German? No, they are not German, they are French. For me, those kinds of exercises where we're trying to teach everything that's not particularly useful for anybody about one particular structure at low levels, because we're trying not to overwhelm them with grammar, that's much more overwhelming for me and much less useful than feeding in little bits of language that help students achieve useful communicative goals or outcomes. You can't ensure that students will remember all the vocabulary presented, but what you can do is to recycle and revise and do revision activities, make revision cards, use Quizlet, all that kind of thing. I think with the CEFR, Vic, it basically focuses students on thinking about what the goal of language teaching is. The goal of language teaching is not just to do exercises that manipulate grammar structures. The goal of language teaching is to communicate. And the CEFR has informed outcomes a lot by helping us think about, at different levels, what kinds of things should we expect students to be able to do using the vocabulary and grammar that we've already taught them. What kinds of words should we teach for beginners? Well, the answer to that is in our beginner course book, Samal. I think we're running out of time. For those of you who still have questions, please do email me, okay? It's hugh@lexicallab.com. The one other thing I should say is if you're on Facebook, we're also there if you want to contact us that way. It's Hugh, Dellar, Andrew, Walkley. I think that's right. And finally, For those of you that use Instagram, we use Instagram and we do a kind of advanced level 1-minute English videos 3 or 4 times a week. So there's plenty of channels for you to contact us.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, Hugh, for that really interesting webinar. Again, just thanks all for joining. The certificate of attendance is available at the top of the screen to download. If you're having any problems with it, I know sometimes it gives people some issues with the Adobe platform. We will be emailing that to you. You should get that within 3 business days, so just stay tuned for that. We also will be sending a recording of this session as well as the slides, and the slides and recording will be available on our website, eltngl.com/webinars, so you can view those at any time there. And we actually have a whole archive of different webinars. We have several with both Hugh and Andy on there if you're interested in seeing some of their previous webinars, so definitely be sure to check that out if you have a moment. Again, I'm seeing questions about downloading it. Don't worry if you can't download it. We will be emailing that to you, so just stay tuned for that. Last but not least, we do have a survey. I have a link down below. I've been putting it in the chat box a little bit, and I'll also direct everyone to this after. We'd love to hear feedback about this webinar so we can keep bringing you webinars that are useful to you and help your teaching practice. So be sure to take a moment to fill that out if you have time. Our next webinar won't be until the new year, so January, but we look forward to hopefully seeing you then. And we'd love for you also to follow our In Focus blog for teachers of English. Angie Walkley recently and Hugh have a blog series there, so you can check that out. They'll have a new post going out pretty soon. And then we are on social as well, and we'd love for you to connect with us and be part of our online teaching community for teachers of English. So thank you all for joining today, and I hope you have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Bye, Hugh.